Hi everyone. Today's video is going to be about hypergamy. So, I'm sure most of you know that hypergamy has been blowing up on social media recently. There are more and more posts on social media talking about hypergamy, which was once a somewhat obscure topic within the manosphere, but now it's starting to enter the mainstream. So, hypergamy is considered a problem by many, and in this video, I'm going to be going over some ideas for solutions, both collective and individual, to hypergamy. So, to start out, what is hypergamy? I'm just going to give a brief explanation. So, the general older definition of hypergamy is people dating individuals with higher social and or economic status than them. So this is the historical definition of hypergamy, the more sort of politically correct definition of hypergamy that you might even hear people like Jordan Peterson talking about, women tend to marry up in status, you know, guys that make more money than them have a more prestigious job. But the specific manosphere definition, which you're often hearing about on social media, from black pill communities, red pill communities, the specific definition that the manosphere uses is that women's tendency is to date men with higher mate value than themselves. So men that are better looking. That's probably the most common way you're seeing it used nowadays, actually, is that women are dating up in looks. A male 7 is going for, more often than not, a female 5. So the modern definition of hypergamy has support from statistics that it's actually true. And even in academia, you will find support for it, but not directly. You'll find data that supports it because data doesn't have, political or ideological bias. Academia is often censored and restricted based on notions of feminism and political correctness. But at the beginning of this video, I showed these charts that on their own honestly kind of prove hypergamy. Maybe not, like, maybe some more academic people might be like, you haven't actually shown any peer reviewed studies that prove hypergamy. But I mean, not this chart right here, because that's just an illustrative chart. But this chart is based on real data, if I recall correctly. And this one definitely is. On Tinder, hypergamy is very brutal. In case some people are, questioning the scientific rigor of my claim around hypergamy, I mean, this is a study that supports it. So basically, this is a study from David Buss, and he was kind of testing and finding data that supports the parental investment hypothesis, Triver's theory, like the parental investment theory, that states that women are more likely to be selective in dating because they have higher investment in offspring because they carry the baby for 9 months, of course. And he did a cross cultural analysis that really supported that women are more selective overall on a large selection of different traits than men are. So, why is hypergamy a problem? So, here's some common criticisms from just, broader society, especially like, woke people, feminists. So, the biggest one you'll see is hypergamy is a myth. Like, most people just outright will deny hypergamy and say, I see so many um, attractive women with unattractive men. Most of the time when they say that, they're actually just referring to couples, the rare cases, well, not the rare cases, the minority of cases where the couple was actually looks matched. And they think that couples where the woman is clearly dating up are actually just equal because people are biased to see women as more attractive. And also, they will say this is just natural selection. So that's a common retort to it, is that this is just, you know, how things play out in nature. A small percentage of men are able to mate with all the women, and the rest are kind of just left in the dust. But the problem with this common criticism is that Well, it's not like women are exactly happy with our current dating market either. I'm sure they have it. I know they have it way better than we do, but they still have plenty of complaints about being used for sex and stuff like that, used for intimacy. But couldn't you just argue that that is just part of nature? And also, just because something's part of nature doesn't mean it's good. That's the naturalistic fallacy. And then let people date who they want. And the problem with this is that a lot of people who mention hypergamy aren't necessarily going to disagree with this. I don't necessarily disagree with this. I don't think people should be forced, literally forced to date people that they don't want to date. But my general retort to people saying that hypergamy is not a problem is that women chasing after a small percentage of men has many downstream consequences, including the epidemic of male romantic loneliness. So, this is part of the broader male loneliness epidemic, which has had some pretty negative effects on men's mental health. You know, I think we've seen increasing suicide rates in recent years, if I recall correctly, and men actually make up 80% of suicides. And men are more likely to be socially isolated overall, but also more likely to be romantically isolated and to be without any dating options, which, obviously causes a lot of suffering for many men. We're also seeing less family creation. Here's a chart of the US birth rate. As you can see, it's been going down steadily since 2007, which was the year I was born, actually. Interesting. So, less family creation. This also ties into economic consequences. A lower birth rate is obviously bad for a country's economy, population collapse. Um, and we're also seeing economic consequences around young men being less motivated to work. And why they're less motivated to work, this is more of like a hypothesis that some people have discussed. But it seems like the reason men are motivated to make money is more often than not because they have romantic options. Single men are not really motivated to, you know, climb the corporate ladder or anything like that. Most men that are single are more or less happy living a pretty humble life. It's women who are really, chasing after the status, and guys want to meet that demand from women and climb the corporate ladder. And that's kind of why you're seeing young women actually out earn young men, because there's just less motivation these days for young men to make money because they don't have any sort of wife or child to support. They don't even have the prospects of getting married. Young men are not getting married these days at high rates. So at the very least, this problem should be acknowledged because it's a real problem. It's causing real, consequences, downstream effects. And I'm not saying that, you have to get behind some sort of solution to it, but acknowledging the suffering is the first step, I think. Because if you don't acknowledge someone's suffering, then these people will just feel increasingly disenfranchised. And that can't be good. And a lot of people are just making jokes out of this. I love contributing to the male loneliness epidemic. This is just a shirt I found while doing research for this video. I just searched male loneliness epidemic on Google Images and this came up. I love contributing to the male loneliness epidemic. It's just turned into a joke, Like people don't take it seriously. So how feasible is the idea that there even is a solution? So this is a poll I saw from YBC Too Cold. And I was kind of split about how I was supposed to answer this, actually. When I first saw this poll, I was actually part of the minority that said false. So it says there are no real solutions to hypergamy that do not involve the suppression of a certain group's freedom, autonomy, and right to choose who they mate with. So I said false. But I realized that that's actually pretty true. Like, I think there are no permanent, real solutions to hypergamy that wouldn't involve some sort of suppression of freedom. Now, it doesn't have to be a total control of who people get with. But I think that in order for the dating market to change and become less hypergamous, some sort of changes need to be made by force if we want to see permanent change. So, people who acknowledge hypergamy, which is a minority of people, struggle and debate around what the solution to hypergamy is going to be. So some people believe that there's no solution at all. So some people are more doomeristic. They think, okay, this is just the nature of things, you know? This is how things are in nature. This is the way things have kind of always been. And maybe the small blip in time where most men were able to get married was just that, just a blip. And some believe men can take individual action in order to overcome this, which has some, overlap with people that think that the societal issue will never stop. So, I'm definitely in the camp that I believe men can take individual action to kind of get over this problem by kind of self-improving. And then some people believe that a broader societal change is also possible. And I think that I kind of fall into both of these categories. I believe that men can take individual action, but I also think that societal change is possible. So, here are the individual solutions that people suggest. So, there's really only one actually, and it's just boss up, you know? There's a segment of the manosphere that acknowledges it's unfair, but simply tells men just to self-improve, you know? They acknowledge that hypergamy and, hoflation are a problem, but, they just say, it's tough out there. It's not fair, but you got to self improve. So, this is a video that relates to this, which is actually quite a good video that I agree with um, most parts of from It's Complicated, which is a really good channel. He kind of exposes the contradictions in women's thinking really well. So, I would definitely recommend checking out his channel.
When it comes to the manosphere and the red pill, what's your biggest gripe with these guys? Like people like Sartain, Fresh and Fit, like those types of shows.
It's just become this grift. And I look at it as mainly just gynocentric cope. I mean, if you're going to tell me that looks maxing isn't a cope, I mean, when women had to go through all these, ridiculous beauty standards, they got eating disorders. That was a big problem. But now we're going to do bone smashing and we're going to reconstruct our face. Or, you're going to complain about something called hoflation. Men have to work 5 times harder than their grandfathers did, for women 20 times worse. And yet everyone's advice is just boss up, level up, self-improvement. You're essentially telling men to work 5 times harder. So why are you promoting the very thing that we're complaining about? I look at the whole thing and I say, we need civil rights, not self-improvement. I'm not against the idea of self-improvement, but I would like to see the manosphere focus more on collective action and not individual action.
So yeah, that was a good video, and I agree that the manosphere, it doesn't focus at all on collective action. It only focuses on individual action. But I think that both coexist, and I think that might be what he thinks, that It's Complicated channel guy thinks too. But I think they really both have a place, and I think that the red pill is really the only place where guys get to, express the issues that come with being a man today. So I think the red pill has overall done more good than it's done harm for men. That self improvement can give you results, but there are some questions that come along with it. So the question a lot of people will ask is the juice worth the squeeze? So is it worth it to, chase women, to really focus on self improvement above on all else instead of just living your life for yourself? And I think that's a valid question. And the juice maybe isn't worth the squeeze for everyone, but I think most guys will be happier dating women than not dating women, even though there are a lot of issues and a lot of heartache and a lot of work that goes into dating women, especially women that are attractive. And does it self improving make things worse on a societal scale? So he kind of hinted at this. And my answer to that would be actually no. So here's my theory: the red pill self improvement is actually an equalizer. So, as a counter argument to the claim that red pill is just making things worse, I will argue that it actually evens the playing field sometimes. So, an example of this would be, you know, teaching men game and social skills and making this knowledge more widely available. In the internet era, anyone could really access this knowledge. We are giving men who aren't naturally at the top a fighting chance, you know? Because the guys that are already at the top, who are born, good looking, high status, they already have maybe some natural charisma, aren't going to study game and social skills like guys who are not born at the top will. So that kind of levels the playing field because, is a woman going to choose like a more average looking guy who has like really good charisma, really good game and social skills because he trained that up? Or is she going to choose a naturally good looking guy who maybe doesn't have as much game because he's, just had women handed to him his whole life? You know, that kind of puts the odds more in the favor of the guy who started out with less value. The guy who is maybe in the bottom 90% of guys, where, you're probably going to be struggling somewhat. However, I will say that this isn't a mass scale societal solution, because, you know, no matter what you do, most guys are probably not going to be into game and social skills. Most guys are just going to live their life. And more or less, guys that are kind of born with, average SMV are probably just going to stay average SMV and not really work to self improve or not work on game. They're probably just going to live their life naturally. And, maybe a woman will fall into their lap at some point, but maybe not. So, here are some collective solutions that people suggest. So, the most commonly mentioned solutions are state mandated girlfriends, traditionalism, and I guess I already said the word, but intimacy robots. So, starting out with state mandated girlfriends, I would say that this is extremely unlikely to happen. So we would run into some legal issues with this. I feel like, it would be seen as like a violation of human rights to mandate that women marry a certain guy, because of like freedom of association and all that stuff. Not that like I don't think that these sorts of rights can kind of be overridden sometimes if there are huge issues that we kind of need to address. But I still think it would be extremely unlikely to happen. And it would be viewed as being essentially SA because you're basically forcing women to get with guys that they don't want to get with. So this is like the like honestly the worst fear of a lot of women. There's that one book about this very dystopian society where women are forced to have men's babies. I forgot what it was called, but I'm sure some of you know what book I'm talking about. The women would be extremely resentful of this dynamic, and I think it's too extreme. I think women would have pretty much no genuine attraction to guys they're forced to be with. This idea really isn't taken seriously. It's more of a meme, I'm pretty sure. Like, most people that mention this are just memeing, just making jokes. They're not actually seriously proposing this. So, intimacy robots. So, realistic ones are unlikely to be available in the near future. Like, the technology is just not there. There are a lot of nuances in human movement. This one only looks semi realistic. And any robots you see now don't really have natural movements. So, they're not going to be realistic. They're just going to be like, intimacy dolls that kind of move a little bit on their own in the near future. And they will likely be extremely expensive for a short time after they come out. So when they come out, they're probably going to be extremely expensive. Only a small group of elite men with elite finances will be able to afford them. And it isn't a replacement for real intimacy. Even if they were completely realistic, you would still know in the back of your head that it's too perfect, you know, or just not real. There's the validation that comes from knowing that there's a real human being there that actually cares about you, that actually finds you attractive. That can't be replaced with these sort of intimacy robots. But I will admit that this could give men slightly more leverage. We already do have slightly more leverage because we have, the option of those, S sex dolls, but, the guys that get them these days are mostly just neckbeards, like basement dwellers. And that's not me just, hating on them, but that's just the reality. Like guys aren't really getting these dolls unless they're like very low value, and have no hope at all. So it's seen more as just like a last resort. The next one we have is traditionalism. So this is probably the most viable of the options mentioned so far, and it has a real, history behind it. Like this is, a classic 1950s sort of family. These dynamics already existed. This sort of society existed for a time where guys were the head of the household, and the woman kind of deferred to them, and it was traditional monogamy. Usually the woman would be a virgin upon marriage, or not have all this sexual history. Would be the same for the man often too. No fault divorce didn't exist, so people would stay together for long. This actually existed, and that's why it's more feasible than the options I mentioned before, because we could actually have a model that we could go back to. But it's unlikely for society to do a complete 180 like this. You don't really see this in that many cultures, just society going back to full traditionalism. Like I can't really think of any examples like that where a society like wasn't traditional at all, like our current culture, and just went back to full traditionalism. Like it would meet a lot of resistance, and it wouldn't be enacted by government. That's the thing. It would have to be a broader cultural change. And I just don't know what would trigger that. Like if we got rid of no fault divorce, that wouldn't actually change the core of our culture that doesn't actually prioritize staying together forever. But, these dynamics have their own issues. The idea that humans are meant to stay together forever is actually kind of a delusion. Like that's not how humans evolved at all. We evolved to be serially monogamous. We have these relationships and then we split up. So lifelong love doesn't actually exist really. It's more like the reasons these relationships appeared to work was more just because they were just like a contract or a commitment. And that kind of makes it not look as glamorous. Like these dynamics undeniably weren't perfect. Like I don't want to be the one that just does all the work and is just liked from my finances. That's like the beta bucks nightmare that guys have nowadays. So do you really want to go back to where you were valued for a paycheck, for how much money you were making for providing? Not really. Like that I don't want that to be like most of why a woman values me, you know? And also you could make ethical arguments about like, oh, women's rights and all that. The gender should be treated equally. And I agree with that, but the thing is, men have not been able to leave our roles like women have. So if we actually returned not returned, if we actually became equal between the genders, men would actually unlock a lot of rights. But the thing is, I don't think that gender roles are necessarily bad. I just think that the gender roles are being very unfairly enforced, to where men are expected to bear a massive burden in terms of just rejection and navigating dating that women don't have to. We are really have to be the pursuers. And ideally, you know, we would have some sort of sex differences in roles because that's just biology. We're not going to stamp out biology, but we want them to be fair, and we don't want to uniformly say that everyone has to be a certain way. It should be more lax than that, is what I think. So here's my proposal, which is a little unique, a little out there, but I just think that there aren't enough people that are actually brainstorming solutions, so I thought I'd just give out my own for hypergamy. So, society is not likely to be willing to directly restrict women's freedom because of gynocentrism. Any sort of policy that directly targets women and what women are doing would just never work because women are perpetually just seen as victims, and men as perpetrators. So saying that women are being too picky and that they're unfairly excluding certain guys and it's negatively affecting guys and society would just not be well recepted. So female interests are going to be prioritized generally. So I have a genius idea. Instead of restricting women, we could instead restrict the top 5% or so of men from monopolizing and sharing the women in soft harems like they have been. This would be essentially abolishing informal polygyny by restricting the amount of sexual partners a man can have in a year. So the effect of this would be women wouldn't all be able to sleep with the top 5%. Only a small amount of women would be able to get the most high value guys. And these would probably be the most high value women. Because if you're like, a very high value guy and you can only sleep with a certain amount of women every single year, you would probably choose your most attractive options, right? So the good thing about this is that it doesn't restrict women's freedom directly. So you'll have better reception because promiscuous men who use women for intimacy are broadly unpopular with both genders, but especially women. So I think the way we could kind of package this in our current gynocentric society is that we're restricting these predatory, men that just want to use women and pump and dump. But in reality, that this is going to also probably more so massively benefit the men that have been, oppressed. I don't know if that's the right word, just very disadvantaged because of hypergamy. So this would be more likely to get broad support because I could see actually a lot of feminists be supporting this, like support ending this sort of, culture where these certain number of men are just like using women for sex and treating them like objects. There is some historical precedent for something like this, not as much as like, going back to, traditional roles, but like a lot of religions that support monogamy, like Christianity, Judaism, maybe some other religions came to support this because it seemed to stabilize society and it also got rid of the unfair advantage that the guys who were monopolizing women had during a certain period of time in history. The Y chromosome kind of collapsed, and a very small amount of men were passing on their genes. And this was because they were kind of monopolizing the resources. So polygyny has been common in a lot of societies historically, and the monogamy norm seems to have been a way to kind of stabilize society and also ensure that every single man or most men could get a wife. What this is doing instead is fighting informal polygyny, not just like polygyny in terms of one man having several wives. But back then there wasn't like a hookup culture, in these historical societies where polygyny was common, there was no such thing as a hookup culture. People got married was the thing, and then there was a marriage of several women to one guy. But nowadays, the dynamic we're seeing is several women dating one guy. So it's kind of a bit analogous to that, where we're just adapting to the circumstances we're seeing now and fighting polygyny, the monopolization of access to women. So there are some potential issues with my solution. So So practical implementation could be hard. So like how are we going to collect data around a man's level of promiscuity? Couldn't that involve, you know, violating some rights, to privacy or whatever? What would be the social and or legal consequences? And I would say it's to be determined, but my proposal is still the strongest overall, I think. So it's more likely to have like wide approval like I've went over before. And, we've had some precedent for, the government kind of ignoring civil liberties in pursuit of a larger goal. After 9/11, we had, you know, we had the Patriot Act, which kind of increased the surveillance state, you know? Like, a lot of people could argue that that was unconstitutional, but it served a purpose, you know? I'm not saying it was good or bad, but I'm saying it served a purpose and it was approved. So, couldn't you say that this hypergamy problem poses, an existential threat to our society and needs some sort of, addressing? Or you could say that about, promiscuity. The promiscuity of certain men and just using women for sex. Couldn't you say that that's a huge societal issue to where, you know, the right to privacy might get overridden? People might say, well, isn't this just socialism just applied to dating? And I would say not really. It's more analogous to like a reform to dating because I'm not saying that we should completely get rid of the dating market, and turn women into public property, like state mandated girlfriends, or even some form of like traditionalism. I'm saying more like it's like we should operate in a free, like a genuinely free market, A genuinely free market doesn't have monopolies. We need to give, you know, the vast majority of guys need to have a fighting chance to actually see success, And that's what this is more analogous to. So, yeah, that's me addressing some of the counter arguments or potential issues with my proposal. In the meantime, I have some suggestions for individuals. So, in the meantime, you should self improve because society is unlikely to change immediately. Like we're not going to see an end to hypergamy, within the next decade, I bet. I would bet like all my life savings that hypergamy is still going to be a thing in 10 years. So don't count on hypergamy suddenly ending because, some guys are getting upset about it on social media and it's becoming a bigger thing. It's still not mainstream yet, though it has been getting addressed more and more, like the male loneliness epidemic stuff overall. And that's just because the issue has become so bad that it's undeniable. So you kind of see it bubbling under the surface, but it's not fully hit the mainstream yet. So, in terms of collective action, I'd say continue to spread and speak the truth around hypergamy and advocate for change. Because don't just be doomeristic, because it is possible that we could live in a better world. You know, just because we haven't seen change yet doesn't mean that there won't be change in the future. This movement is really becoming huge, and I don't know if it's just because I'm in some sort of bubble, but I really don't think that's the case. I really think that, you know, this sort of, red pill, black pill culture, especially black pill culture, is really going mainstream right now. Well, almost going mainstream. It's really blowing up on social media.